From pariah to peacemaker, Saudi Arabia's crown prince mending fences with Syria and Iran, soothing rivalries with the Gulf rivals, and now welcoming the Biden administration's point man on security to Jeddah. 10 months after that frosty fist bump with the U.S. President Mohammed bin Salman, talking peace, brokering in Sudan, and a wind down of his 8-year campaign in Yemen. Since last July, when Biden visited, the same MBS has cut deals with Washington's rivals, signing unprecedented pacts with China, agreeing to oil production cuts with under sanctions Russia. But the channels are far from cut with the United States. So, can Saudi Arabia be all things to all powers? And more broadly, how much has the kingdom changed, or not, since the murder of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018? Has MBS changed? And if so, in what way? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what constitutes undoubtedly a new chapter for Saudi Arabia. And joining us from Riyadh, Salman Al-Ansari, founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Thanks for joining us. Yasmin Farouk is non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Lila Jacinto, senior editor, France24.com, is with us as well. How are you?
Good to be here.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. In Jeddah, Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, thanking his host for evacuating U.S. nationals from Sudan. On Sunday, the Saudi Royal Navy's HMS Abha evacuating more than 200 stranded Yemenis from Port Sudan to Jeddah. The Saudis have ferried more than 8,000 to their shores since fighting broke out more than 3 weeks ago between rival generals. One image that was published on April 25th has gone viral, that of a Saudi servicewoman carrying a baby off of one of those ships, and it's captured the imagination of citizens of the kingdom and beyond. Before we go to our panel, let's first, though, go to Jeddah. France 24 correspondent Bastien Renouille is there. Bastien, first off, your reaction when it comes to Saudi's role in welcoming these evacuees from Sudan?
Well, I can tell you that yesterday I was in the military port of Jeddah when the two boats, there were two actually, docked in the port on board 452 Yemenis. I can tell you that the scenes were the same that you just described, with women and children disembarking first, soldiers taking care of their babies, carrying their luggages. Saudi Arabia wants to be the evacuating hub of the region at the moment, especially for foreigners. You say that several thousand of people have already been evacuated by the Saudi Navy from Port Sudan. And not only the Saudis are evacuating these people. France sent a boat here, Le Lorraine. It was carrying 500 people, mostly UN workers and their families. The US also evacuated their citizens through Jeddah. And there is even a local ferry company evacuating people from Sudan at the moment. They have a waiting list of 80,000 people. I talked to them this morning. They say that their ferry can only transport 2,000 people, so it's going to take time. It's most likely the evacuation will continue for days or weeks. But let's remember that it's an evacuation hub mostly for foreigners and not for Sudanese, because it's still very difficult for Sudanese to escape from their country. If they want to come here in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, they need a visa for Saudi Arabia or for another country where they will be able to travel. And it's very difficult at the moment for them to get these visas. So a humanitarian hub, yes, for foreigners, but it's still very difficult for Sudanese at the moment to escape from their country.
You were reporting earlier for us, Bastien, how it's an uphill struggle for the Saudis trying to broker those indirect talks between rival generals. Their envoys won't sit down together in the same room. The Saudis working in tandem with the United States, it seems.
Yes, absolutely. They are, of course, trying to help the people of Sudan, the foreigners living there. They're trying to improve the situation, but it's also a strategy with maybe two main goals. First, they want to keep their good relations with the army and the rapid support forces. You know that they were both involved in the war in Yemen. They're both allied of the Saudi kingdom. And it's impossible at the moment to know who's going to win this war. Whether it will be General Hemeti, the head of the rapid support forces, or General Burhan, the head of the army. So it's important for the Saudi to keep good relations with the two of them. It's also a solution to improve the perception of the role of the kingdom in the regional affairs. I can tell you that most TVs around the world, and especially in the region, are focusing on the evacuations, and there are not many to focus on the situation, like how did this situation escalate, who agreed to negotiate with the two generals during the past years after the revolution in 2019, but also after the coup in 2021. And I can tell you that in Khartoum, many of my contacts do not believe in this narrative. They say that there is a lack of transparency at the moment. How can they trust what's happening behind closed doors? They don't know what's the process, how it's happening. They do not want to trust what's happening here. They also say that the current talks are legitimizing the warring parties as if they were natural political actors, and it's very difficult to understand for many Sudanese. And finally, they're asking, why aren't the civilians here in Jeddah to talk with the army, with the rapid support forces? So I can tell you that they're trying to improve their image. They're trying to keep good relations with Sudan, but many civilians do not believe this narrative and do not accept what's happening here.
Bastien Renouille, many thanks for joining us live here in the France 24 debate. Lila Jacinto, just a reaction on Saudi Arabia's role in Sudan.
Well, I mean, Saudi Arabia is actually, if you take away the interests of the Sudanese people, Saudi Arabia is well placed because it, as Bastien said, it has relations with General Burhan as well as Hemeti, the chief of the Rapid Support Forces. And unlike Egypt, which is seen much closer to General Burhan and very much follows the sort of norm of, the army chief, at the head of a vast military-industrial complex. The Sudanese see Egypt and al-Sisi, the Egyptian president, as much more pro-Burhan. So Saudi Arabia is well placed because it talks to both players. But of course, I mean, the elephant in this room is the civilian authorities, and I'm sure we're going to get into this more and more because what we are seeing more and more are these geopolitical games. But what we are losing is any sort of democratic impulses which the people want, whether it's Syria or Sudan. The Arab League, the Arab autocrats, whether they are benign or enlightened or not, are pretty much playing a big geostrategic game at the risk of their civilians.
Salman al-Ansari, of course, it's a truce in a first instance that Saudi Arabia is trying to negotiate. Do you take the point that civilians and those who bravely fought for the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir are left out right now?
Thank you. I think when it comes to Sudan, I think the situation in Sudan is full of confusion, ambiguity, uncertainty, and chaos. It seems that the gloves are off between the army and the RSF with no clear sign of reconciliation. And the Sudanese people are definitely the main victims. To me, I see it to be almost like a zero-sum kind of game rather than a multifaceted one. And it is very unfortunate, and we would love for the Sudanese to get to the negotiating table and resolve their differences and find a solution to have a government that can actually serve the Sudanese people. So that's why I actually agree with your guest that Saudi Arabia is somehow in the middle right now and it is not trying to take side. And it is, but definitely at the end of the day, for me as a political analyst, I'm definitely always with law and order. So I think if the Sudanese government can actually find a way through which they can find a solution in Saudi Arabia, because they are actually meeting right now. They have delegations, the RSF and also the Sudanese army are having delegations in Saudi Arabia to find a solution for this issue. I think the first step is to have a truce and to have humanitarian assistance to be actually going to the people who are who have been affected by this brutal war. And this war is not serving anyone. It's not serving the Sudanese. It's not serving the army. It's not serving the RSF. It's not serving anyone. So it's a war that is not going to end if we are actually having this idea of having these two armies fighting each other, because it's the same actual army. So the Mr. Burhan, the leader of the army, and his deputy, he's actually the one who is fighting each other. So that's not going to be sustainable. So that's why I say, unfortunately, it seems like it's a zero-sum game that will have no insight.
A zero-sum game. Yasmin Farouk, in this crisis, again, I hark back to the image of that Saudi soldier carrying the baby, which went viral in the kingdom itself. Your thoughts on Saudi Arabia's role and how the Saudis perceive themselves in this in this crisis?
Listen, Saudi Arabia has a long, complex, and complicated history with Sudan, whether under Omar al-Bashir or after Omar al-Bashir. In the Arab world, in the Middle East, as it stands today, Saudi Arabia stands out not only as a regional power by default, but also a regional power that kind of is building a national and diplomatic capacity to earn that status and is practicing that status. So today, if you are looking for a regional power with the legitimacy and with the power, with the leverage to intervene in the Sudanese file with international backing and support, it is indeed Saudi Arabia. Now, we can discuss whether the politics of Saudi Arabia or the policies actually since 2019 and until today have helped or have not helped with what's going on right now in Sudan. But if you would like me to discuss that photo actually reflects a very long established Saudi soft diplomacy of aid, of charity, and it is the focus on it and its use even by Saudi media is part of an overall strategy of rebranding, not necessarily in the commercial negative sense, but in the sense of rebuilding the image of Saudi Arabia that has traditionally been tarnished by the war in Yemen, or even before that, the September 11th attacks on the United States. Now, also the fact that the soldier in this photo is a woman is also a reflection of the domestic reforms inside Saudi Arabia and kind of reminds everybody of the status of women in Saudi Arabia today who have been able actually to join the military and, as you can see, play a significant role side by side to their male military men.
Yeah, so it definitely shows a changing of a time in a country where it was only 5 years ago where women got the right to drive. Again, the Saudis are doing this in tandem with the Americans. When it comes to brokering in Sudan, it seemed just a year ago that relations had hit a low with Washington. Last July, there was a visit by Joe Biden. It failed to break the ice on the surface of it or yield results. There was Joe Biden who had called Mohammed bin Salman a pariah on the campaign trail, coming to pay his respects, you might say, last July, at a time of soaring prices at the pump. The U.S. president left Jeddah without any pledges to push down crude prices, and by the same token, to punish the Russians for their invasion of Ukraine. But that's perhaps changing. On Sunday, there was the visit of Jake Sullivan, whose trip to Jeddah paves the way for a visit to the kingdom by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, next month. No images of the four-way meeting that also, by the way, included Indian and Emirati counterparts. But let me read to you from the White House. This is the White House readout of that meeting with the Crown Prince. Sullivan reviewed significant progress in talks to further consolidate the now 15-month-long truce in Yemen, welcoming UN efforts to end the war. Mr. Sullivan thanked the Crown Prince for the support Saudi Arabia has provided to U.S. citizens during the evacuation from Sudan yet again. Well, for more on this, let's go to Washington. Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf State Institute, joins our discussion. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. There's this perception that Saudi Arabia has gone off the United States since that visit by Joe Biden. What does this visit by Jake Sullivan tell you?
Well, I think the perceptions are all muddled, and I think they're very inaccurate. I certainly don't think that last July, with Biden's visit to Jeddah and the GCC+3 meeting, plus the bilaterals between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, was a low point. Between U.S. and Saudi, it's not even close. Historically, this relationship has had many ups and downs, right? I mean, you've got the 73 oil embargo, you've got 9/11 that Yasmin was referring to. Even, I would say, last October, when there was an OPEC plus quota production reduction in order to keep the price from falling too low. That was a crisis between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. It was very short-lived because the Saudis were right when they said it wasn't going to drive the price of oil up. So what you're looking at, I think, really is a relationship that's been on the rebound in a non-linear way. I mean, not just simply getting better and better, but back and forth, but overall improving since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think that forced people on all sides, especially in Washington, to look at the map very carefully again, and to count up strategic advantages and disadvantages vis-a-vis Russia and especially vis-a-vis China.
But hang on a sec. You laid out the timeline for us just there. Biden goes to Jeddah in July, and in October, Saudi Arabia sides with Russia and decides to cut oil production.
I know, but this is a misperception. It was perceived in Washington that they were siding with Russia, but they were not siding with Russia. They were siding with themselves. They were trying to maintain the price of oil, create a floor and a ceiling for the price of oil in order to protect their absolutely non-postponable economic transformation policy. They said it wouldn't raise the price of oil. The Americans were worried it would. It didn't. The Americans calmed down very quickly. That quota was maintained in January. The Americans didn't have a problem with it. And I think there's been, a lot of misperception on both sides. And you're right, that has been getting better. But what I'm trying to stress with October is the non-linearity and the way in which these countries have been misreading each other from time to time. I think the relationship is actually really strong. And you see now in Sudan, they don't hesitate to have each other's back regionally and globally. They make a pretty good partnership, and there's no one else stepping up to the plate to try to broker anything in Sudan other than this Washington-Riyadh partnership. It's the only game in town.
Lila Jacinto, we've been covering, the visit of Xi Jinping to Saudi Arabia, the deals that have been signed, the fact that it's the Chinese that brokered the thaw in relations between Riyadh and Tehran. Do you agree with what Hussein Ibish just said?
Well, I agree, of course, in the fact that Saudi Arabia, with its oil gas quotas, looked out for its own interests, and in fact, that's what we are seeing with the Ukraine invasion. The global South is not towing Europe and Washington's line on basic principles, and the global South values for now seems to be self-interest. That is it. There's this discourse that has come out to the fore post the Ukraine invasion of multipolarity, against these is very much looking at regional players where we don't talk about their domestic how they handle their own citizens, and it's very much regional bullies. It's not international global bullies. It's everyone looking out for themselves, which leaves us with the question of what does the global South stand for? Self-interest.
Self-interest. Okay, let's talk about self-interest. Salman al-Ansari, right now the price of crude is 1/3 lower than it was at the same time 1 year ago. Where does that leave Saudi Arabia, and where does it leave it in its relationship, again, with those OPEC plus nations like Russia?
Yeah, I think Saudi Arabia, as a leader of OPEC and OPEC Plus, it's very interested in stabilizing the oil market as it has always been doing so. So I think the kingdom, with regards to the oil prices, it's not as it used to be when it comes to being heavily invested in only the oil prices. Why? Because 7 years ago, the Saudi economy was 92% dependent on oil. Right now, we are having 56% dependency. It is still a lot, but you see the difference. So I think Saudi Arabia is moving to modernize its economy. But I just want to actually comment about the comment that the previous one with regards to Saudi-US relations. And I think it has always been, and it will always be, the kingdom is going to be committed to this historic and strategic relations with the United States. We fought communism together, we fought terrorism together, and we stabilized the world economy together. So I think there is no doubt in my mind that the Saudi-US relationship will always be there, and it will always find a way through which they can actually complement each other. But to be honest and to be realistic, and I actually want to use the analogy of medicine, the Saudis have always been having an issue with the American policy makers, specifically the ones from the left, with regards to resolving the issues of terrorism in the Middle East. So for the last 4 decades, the Saudis wanted to use the American medicine to eradicate terrorism in the Middle East, but instead we've seen the US to be handing Iraq to Iran, and we've seen how they have been having the appeasement policy with Iran, etc. So that's why Saudi Arabia turned to China, and which is the Chinese medicine, which is a preventative one. It's not as effective to eradicate the causes of the issues, but we want to see if it's going to succeed or not. So that's the Saudi position with regards to having China to mediate between Riyadh and Tehran. But at the end of the day, as I said, Saudi-US relationship is there to stay, and each country needs each other. And we've seen also this, as your guest mentioned, in Sudan. Saudi Arabia managed to evacuate more than 8,000 evacuees from Sudan, up to 110 nationalities from 110 nationalities. And Saudi Arabia, as we know, is the 3rd biggest humanitarian assistant in the world after the US and the UK, according to the United Nations, and the top donor of development assistance in the world, according to the UN. So Saudi Arabia has always been in the forefront when it comes to provide humanitarian assistance to others, but unfortunately we haven't seen this to be heavily covered in the media, because the media is mostly attracted to the ideas of and the notions of demonizing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But I think that's going to change, because facts are stubborn things, and the media should actually uphold the credibility of this.
Let's talk about your analogy about medicine with the Chinese there. Let me put it to Yasmin Farouk. The United States' position, the Biden administration position, is that it supports this thaw in relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because it sees it as a way of perhaps helping to end the conflict in Yemen. Is that what Washington really thinks, in your view?
Well, Washington does want the war in Yemen to end. It's actually, this administration since the beginning had initially very few objectives on its agenda when it came to the Middle East, and one of them is Iran, the other one is the war in Yemen, or ending the war in Yemen, and the two are actually related. So that part is true. But, whether my fellow colleagues, experts, or even statements from officials that were mentioned in the press reflected, of course, an American unease with the role that China is playing here, because it's a role that goes beyond the traditional trade role, the economic role of China, and expanding it not only to diplomacy, but also to security. I mean, Iran is the #1 national security threat to Saudi Arabia. And if this deal works, then it becomes really a linchpin, or, a very solid pillar of the Saudi-Chinese partnership. And so despite positive reactions and encouragements, I think that there was an unease with the Chinese role, even if both sides, the Saudi side and the American side, said that Saudi government kept the U.S. administration in the loop, updating it on the Chinese mediation between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Saudi Arabia, which again, its crown prince meeting on Sunday with Joe Biden's national security advisor, and they weren't alone at that meeting. Saudi Arabia has not yet formally formally normalized relations with Israel, but the Sunday talks in Jeddah facilitated for an initiative. I guess it's got kind of a Star Wars-like acronym. India and the Emiratis, also part of what's called I2U2, officially a coalition focused on economic development and food security. And it's reviving long-held hopes, for instance, of a rail connection between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Rail networks between Israel and the UAE would allow India to ship goods to the UAE, which would then be spirited by train across Saudi Arabia and Jordan before crossing Israel at Bet Shehan and arriving at Haifa port and then on to Europe. India had tried a northern route, by the way, via Iran to ship goods, but that project never materialized. Leila Jacinto, we've been talking about superpower tensions, right? The U.S. and Russia and the Americans trying to get the Saudis to take sides here. The U.S. a little bit wary, as you heard Yasmin say, when it's China playing the broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia. India also has a stake in this fight. It, too, is wary of China. And so if there is this commercial deal, for India, it's also security, a strategy.
For sure. I mean, so many players, so many chess pieces. Just a little pushback on U.S.-Saudi relations. Yes, of course, it's long-standing. It's had its ups and downs, but U.S. seems to be caught on a back foot, as Yasmin says. That's the difference right now. When it comes to this rail pipeline, Israel was not included in the talks. The I2U2 is Israel and India, and the UAE and the US. I think...
Which is normal, because Israel and Saudi Arabia formally don't have relations yet.
Exactly. And I think Benjamin Netanyahu's hardline policies are alienating Riyadh. So, they won't quite have Israel on the table. But with India and the US, the interests are more and more overlapping because they see China as a major threat. So this completely makes sense to have this sort of Indian version of China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah. So China has changed its role absolutely, and India is watching this, is not happy with this. The Chinese medicine, by the way, the Chinese medicine of diplomacy. When you hear the word sovereignty, it's always the subtext is do not mess in human rights affairs, which means the sovereign who is in charge of this country can do as he or she wills, most always he, and so of course the Chinese medicine goes down very well with non-democracies.
Hussein Ibish, is it in Saudi Arabia's interest ultimately to be pushing this? First of all, for commercial reasons, obviously, but also because at the end of the day, their interests might lie more with the West, presumably.
Yes, no, I mean, I think the answer is yes. Look, they came to the conclusion a long time ago, as did the UAE and Israel. In other words, the U.S.'s traditional security partners and major trading partners in the Middle East all came to the conclusion over about a decade, beginning around the time of the Iraq War, that strategic diversification was almost as important, or maybe as important, as tending the relationship with Washington. So that you needed simply to add to the strategic toolkit. You need to reach out to Russia, you need to reach out to China, you need to reach out to each other, as in the case of the Abraham Accords, and even with adversaries like Iran. So I think it's certainly in Saudi Arabia's interest to cooperate with China in developing relations with Beijing beyond simply buying and selling energy. But the underlying security relationship with the United States remains paramount. I think that's clear. If you look at every agreement that was signed between Riyadh and Beijing, not one of them crossed the American red line. The Americans know they can't stop the evolution of this relationship, but they can put a red line, which is don't do anything. And this is addressed to Israel and the UAE as well as Saudi Arabia. Don't do anything that gives Beijing an undue strategic foothold in this crucial region. You can do any kind of infrastructure development, joint R&D investment, anything like that, as long as it doesn't have dual-use military applications, as long as it doesn't give Beijing signals intel capability, as long as it doesn't enhance in a significant way China's strategic position in the region. And they were very, very careful, the Saudis, very careful not to break that line on any aspect, even when it came to 5G and Huawei. They only agreed to a cloud computing deal with Huawei, which doesn't cross the line. They were extremely cautious not to do that because they're playing a double or a triple game here, expanding relations with China while maintaining, especially under the hood, particularly vis-a-vis Iran, very close ties to the U.S., expanding certain kinds of cooperation, even with Israel and others, and at the same time doing this sort of diplomatic outreach to Tehran so that you have multiple different approaches operating at different registers of reality. But the fundamental one, the security one, remains a close partnership with Washington. That's a fact. People talk about Beijing's emerging security role based on this agreement with Iran. There is no Chinese security role in the Middle East. It cannot have a security role in the Middle East because it does not have the ability to project power into the Gulf region. It does not have a blue water navy. It cannot play a security role. What it can play is a diplomatic role and maybe even a political role. But security, that's decades off, and I wouldn't hold my breath on it, frankly.
So you agree, Salman al-Ansari?
Yeah, I think, okay, here's the thing. I think there's a lot of exaggeration with regards to the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman here in Saudi Arabia. Some journalists are actually talking about Saudi Arabia as nothing but a wishful thinking for the time being. And I see this meeting to be mostly centered in two themes. One is Sudan for sure. The second is the U.S. desire to have Saudi Arabia to join the I2U2 or U2I2. I don't know how they came up with that name. The group, as we know, has these 4 countries, but at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia is not having any normal relations with Israel. So how can they join this group? Maybe they can facilitate something for that group, that is possible, but not with high probability. I think, to answer your question, the U.S. is acting desperately to encircle China with different pacts and groups of countries. And in this case, definitely they want India to be more integrated strategically with the Middle East. And it is already integrated in the Middle East. So, but also to become an economic substitute.
Desperate, Salman.
I don't see this going to work. I don't think this is going to work. Because all the Middle Eastern countries, including Israel, enjoy strong relations with both India and China.
So why did Saudi Arabia recently purchase 121? That's a huge order. 121 Boeing Dreamliner aircraft.
As I said earlier, Saudi-US relationship is strong, but at the same time, we are not going to take side in such a manner that actually would jeopardize the trajectory of our relations with our strategic allies and partners, such as China or India or any other country. Saudi Arabia is not going to be taking side anymore. Saudi Arabia is an equalizer, is having this kind of idea of centricity, and it's not going to be a pawn, but a player on the chessboard.
Yasmin Farouk?
I think that's right.
I mean, I agree, especially with the last point, is that, there is always a perception that what is called the global south, and I mean, I would push back against this expression, but if we even consider it the global south, that in that global south, Saudi Arabia is hedging or balancing. I think Saudi Arabia perceives itself as a global player, and so does the UAE. They are not just, a ball that global powers throw to each other or want to have in their camp. They see themselves as a player. It's a G20 country. It's one of the top, as he said, 8 donors per capita, just to be more specific, humanitarian donor. It has so much influence in international organizations, in international financial organizations. So we're not talking about a small country. Now, when it comes to China's role, I'll push back against my good friend Hussein Abesh here, because what China is doing is presenting another form of, or another definition of regional security. Instead of putting boots on the ground that have actually didn't help with de-escalation, it is offering another form of security in the terms of guarantee. I have a leverage over Iran that is very significant, and I am no guarantee in the deal. I mean, within just the framework of this deal, that, or at least this is how it is presented and perceived in Riyadh, that China is willing to use its weight with Iran to guarantee some kind of de-escalation, some kind of, non-aggression arrangement, coexistence in the Gulf. And that's the sense of, again, quote unquote, security, and not necessarily the military security that I totally agree with you, only the United States can offer. And I'm not sure that Gulf countries, and especially Saudi Arabia, would like to change that, actually. I am not sure that they want to exchange, their security and defense relationship with the United States for one with China or even Russia, even if it purchases, missiles or drones from other countries.
Hussein, your thoughts on this, especially...
I think that's absolutely right.
Especially when it comes to drones, because right now it's Iranian-made drones that are raining down on Ukraine. Surely Saudi Arabia is paying attention.
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think one of the biggest game changers, one of the biggest inflection points in this whole tangled scheme was the September 2019 Iranian missile and drone attack on Abqaiq and Khurais, Saudi Aramco key facilities inside Saudi Arabia, knocked much of the Saudi oil production offline for a few days, and announced the potency of Iran's not only missile and drone arsenal, but precision and a hyper-precision guidance and its intelligence capabilities, right? They knew what to hit, they were able to hit them, and they got away with it because Donald Trump, who's supposedly great friends with Riyadh, just said, hey, no Americans were killed, whatever, no big deal, I'm moving right along here. Now, since the Ukraine invasion, Joe Biden took a rather different attitude. When Iran was threatening Saudi Arabia a few months ago, U.S. scrambled some, I think it was F-22s, we don't really know, but seems like that's what they were, for an aggressive overflight along the Iranian border. The Iranians backed down. They didn't attack Saudi Arabia. And instead, what we got was China delivering Iran to the negotiating table in Beijing, and then Iran delivering the Houthis to the negotiating table.
Because you've preempted my next question, Hussein, which was why it is then that Saudi Arabia and Iran have broken the ice.
Well, I think it makes sense for them to do it now. For 100 years, and including since the 1979 so-called Islamic Revolution in Iran, Saudi-Iranian relations have had ups and downs. They've had thaws, they've had freezes, and this agreement to reestablish diplomatic relations takes us back at least to before 2016, and probably will take us back even further. It's in everyone's interests right now to de-escalate in the region. Everyone that projected power in the Middle East, including Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, pretty much everybody, especially hegemonic power. So it applies a little less to Israel. But everyone that tried to influence others is sort of overextended, is a little bit exhausted. They all need to turn inward. After COVID, they need to rebuild their economies. They need to rebuild their political legitimacy. They need to see what can be done outside of this context of conflict and confrontation that dominated the decade after the Arab Spring uprisings, beginning in around the end of 2010. And I think that's finally reached the interest of Tehran. They've become very interested in what can be done while not being willing to compromise on this network of armed gangs that they run in neighboring Arab states like Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Yemen and even Bahrain. They are willing to discuss ending the Yemen war. They're willing to discuss, sort of de-escalation. It's very much in their interests. It's in their economic interests. It's in all kinds of interests. And they're, because they are not being forced to reconsider their main security policy, which is based on two things: the missile and hyper precision guidance that we talked about, and this network of armed gangs like Hezbollah and the other militias. Since they're not being forced to reconsider either of those, why not? It makes sense for them. For Saudi Arabia, it makes sense, especially economically. As we say, they have this economic project which forces them to cooperate with Russia to create a ceiling and a floor for the price of oil, but also ultimately to cooperate with Iran and to get as much focus of their national energy on the transition to a post-hydrocarbon economy. They've got about 30, 35, maximum 40 years before it becomes too late to do that. That's not a lot of time. It's a big country with a lot of people. It's not a city-state. It's a big country. And it's a little overdue. They can't really postpone it. So it's in their interest, both of them.
Both of them. When Mohammed bin Salman was defense minister 8 years ago, he played offense, leading the coalition against Iranian-backed Houthi militias in Yemen. But as the panel's been saying, times have changed. China, of course, recently brokering that renewal of diplomatic ties with Tehran. And now, over the weekend, Saudi Arabia pushing successfully the return of Iran-backed Syria into the Arab League ahead of an upcoming summit in Riyadh. The United States on the record criticizing this readmission of Assad's Syria. But Leila Jacinto, you take Hussein Ibish's point that everyone's exhausted and overextended.
Well, if we look at, we are at an inflection point of what's happening in the policy. And if you just put it down very simplistically into winners and losers, the U.S. is the big loser there. Yes, of course, the Saudi-U.S. relations will stay that way because Saudi Arabia is under the U.S. military security cover. China is not there quite yet. So yes, the U.S. provides Saudi Arabia and the Gulf with security cover. But what does the U.S. get out of it? The U.S. is simply having to say, yes, we're happy with this, sending Jake Sullivan in, just caught on the back foot, not really getting anything out of it. When it comes to Syria back in the Arab League, this is a culmination of intense negotiations that were happening between Syria and Arab League member states. And there were diplomats who were part of the talks, speaking on condition of anonymity, of course, saying that the Assad regime pushed a very hard bargain. At a meeting in Jordan of the foreign ministers of Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, the joint statement had these statements that just raised alerts, which is Syria's sovereignty, of course, everyone will recognize that, and also supporting Syria and its institutions in control of all of Syrian territories. And of course, Bashar al-Assad has regained most of the country, but we do have opposition groups. We have Turkish forces, Turkish-led groups in the region, as well as U.S. forces with Kurdish-led militias fighting against the Islamic State. So
it doesn't mean the conflict is over by a long shot.
Can I strongly challenge the idea the U.S. doesn't get anything out of its security presence? It controls the three waterways, right? The Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea, and the three choke points, the Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandab, and the Strait of Hormuz. It is the biggest single geostrategic advantage, competitive advantage against China and any other energy-dependent rival. It is the ace card in the U.S. hand.
Yes, but that's always been the case. It's not a changing status quo.
Well, okay, so the U.S. is managing the transition to a multipolar world in this new relationship with a more independent and more assertive set of Gulf powers, but consolidating that control. You look at the new systems of surveillance, 24/7 real-time surveillance that are being put in place with Gulf countries and others in those three waterways. It's a new level of security. And yeah, you're right. It's not new, but it's being consolidated, especially since the Ukraine invasion.
Unfortunately, we're out of time because we would have discussed Saudi's soft power, for instance, its most famous ambassador for the 2030 World Cup bid, Paris Saint-Germain's Lionel Messi, more than ever linked with a move to Saudi side Al Hilal, despite his return to practice this Monday. But unfortunately, we're short of time, so we'll have to get everyone back. Salman Al-Ansari, many thanks for joining us from Riyadh. I want to thank Yasmin Farouk, Hussein Ibish in Washington, Leela Jacinto. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.